Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Good. My clock says it's 3:20, and I'm going to start now, not because I'm particularly precious about starting things on time, but because I know that I've got too much stuff in this presentation anyway. So to give myself as good a chance as possible of getting through as much as I can, I'm going to start on time. So first of all, my name's Geoff Watts. I appreciate you coming to this talk. I'm going to be talking about self-organization, and alongside or in the context of self-organization, I'm going to be talking about motivation of people. Does it work? Do people like it? And I'm going to start off with a couple of apologies. One is I know I've broken a few of the fundamental rules around presentations. I have too much material in here. I haven't tested it as much as I would like. It's not going to be as fun as I would like, because it's primarily a collection of the information that I've gathered based around these few questions that I had in my mind around self-organization. So I'm a coach, I'm a trainer, I work with organizations, work with teams that use Scrum primarily. And a fundamental aspect of Scrum, as you know, is this self-organization aspect. And I was really interested in whether it actually works. So what I did was I set up an anonymous survey, which, I don't know, maybe some of you actually replied to, or contributed towards, just to test some hypotheses that I had around self-organization. And this is going to be a collection of some of the interesting results that came out of that survey, plus a little bit of research from the field, if you like. So while this might not be as fun as a presentation as I would like it to be, it's quite interesting from my perspective anyway. Hopefully it will be for you. I don't intend to talk about the World Cup. I know it's going on. There will be no subliminal messages going on in my presentation about the World Cup, but I hope you keep your full attention on what I'm talking about. Okay? Thank you. Okay, first of all then, so why am I talking about this? This is something that particularly interests me. The theory at the moment is that teams are really important. Okay, teams are what drive organizations. They are what drive productivity. They are what drive creativity. So they're absolutely fundamental to what we do. They're also fundamental to agile. Right from the Agile Manifesto, we talk about the best architectures, the best requirements, the best designs emerging from self-organizing teams. It's integral to everything that we do within the agile space. Scrum specifically talks about self-organization. So Mike here is talking about the ability for a team to self-organize around the goals it's being given is fundamental to all agile methodologies, including Scrum. All right. Ken SCHWABER, unsurprisingly, in his first book about Scrum, talked about self-organizing teams. I thought he made a pretty strong claim in that book. So in here he says, the team unfailingly rises to the occasion and manages itself. I think that's a very strong claim to make. Always, always works. Says, I don't know why self-organization works so well, but that doesn't really matter, as long as it does. Well, I am interested in, if it does work, why it does work. So I had some hypotheses, I had some ideas, some questions that I wanted to test out. And there were 4 of them. Okay, the first one was that there's a lot of confusion as to what self-organization actually means. Do we all understand what we mean by the term self-organizing teams? I thought not. Okay. My second hypothesis was that self-organizing teams can be a motivating factor, but not for everybody. My third hypothesis was that self-organizing teams are usually more productive, but not always. Okay, so I'm slightly refuting Ken's claim there that teams unfailingly rise to the challenge. My fourth hypothesis is that self-organization doesn't just happen. There are some factors behind it that make it more likely to work. There are some factors that will make it less likely to work. I was interested in whether I could find out some kind of consensus or some kind of view as to what those factors are, if indeed they do exist. So those were my hypotheses. I'm going to run you through a little bit of data that I collected that will hopefully shed some light on whether I was right to hold those views? Right, so first, there is very little argument as to what makes up a team. That's fairly well understood these days. A team, good example of a team there, not sure whether you guys had the A-team in Norway. Nice example of what I used to watch when I was a child. So I've taken one description of a team. I could have taken many, but I think this is a pretty good one. A small number of people with complementary skills who are committed to a common purpose, common performance goals, and an approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. Okay, I quite like that one. What's small? Esther Derby says less than 10. Scrum says around about 7 plus or minus 2. So we're talking, generally speaking, single figures for a size of a team. They have complementary skills, common purpose, hold themselves accountable. Would anybody disagree with that definition of a team? Most people tend to agree on what a team is. But what self-organization is, perhaps less so. Okay? So my first hypothesis then, there is widespread confusion as to what self-organizing teams means. So some results from my survey. Again, another English thing that you may not pick up on the A-team was American, but we have a game show in the UK called Family Fortunes. I really wanted to play you a clip of that just to show. But basically, they survey the public. They ask a lot of the general public in England what their answers are to the questions, and the contestants have to try and work out what the common answers are. It's a very low-budget, low-denomination game show. All right. So the catchphrase is, "Our survey says," and when the players get it wrong, they get a nice noise of eh. So this is a few results from my survey. Okay, so the question was, what is self-organization? All right. I deliberately tried not to just ask advocates of agile. I tried to cast my net as wide as possible. I think this is some proof that not everybody who answered my survey was overly agreeable to my point of view. Self-organization is waste. It doesn't work. All right. There was some degree of variation in the answers. So some people thought that the term self-organization means that the team has total control to organize however it wants to get the work done. Complete control. One extreme. Self-organization is chaos, was another response. That everybody does what they want. It's one point of view. People can create their own work teams individually without management, so they can decide who they work with. This is somebody else's view of what self-organization meant. Somebody else said the team is given a backlog of work to do and they organize themselves to get it done. So they're not necessarily deciding what gets done, but they decide how it gets done. And that's a difference. It's a different point of view. Empowerment of a group to decide how to accomplish the task. So there was overall a general agreement that self-organization meant that the team could determine how they got things done. There were a few people that believed teams could decide what gets done as well. But generally speaking, there was a broad agreement over how. There was also some disagreement over whether self-organizing teams had leaders. As you can see here, someone said, no one leader, it's a decision by committee. Somebody else said, in self-organizing teams, there is no manager, but there is always a natural leader. So again, some quite big discrepancies at either end of the scale here. This person is there to keep the team motivated and to guide it through the project. Then some people started talking about responsibility. So this was a very free-form answer. Okay, anybody could answer however they liked to this question. What does self-organization mean to you? So talking about a sense of responsibility. It's not about someone will monitor you. It's about a commitment from your side for your job. Interesting description, slightly different to the others. Self-organization is the pattern and form that emerges from chaos based on self-direction and shared goals. And that's an interesting one. And the last one that, yes, that's right. So those were the ones that I decided to keep. There were lots of others. There were lots Lots of responses that perhaps I didn't feel would be a great thing to share with the general public, because this was an anonymous survey. People could say what they wanted, and they did. So I decided that some of them weren't fit for public display. I found it very hard to cut because I thought all of these answers that they gave were really interesting. They displayed a lot of different viewpoints on what I consider to be quite an important subject. So these ones I kept. I want then to compare it to a little bit of industry thinking, if you like, some kind of accepted literature. So this is a quote from Kimball Fisher. Now, he's talking about self-directed work teams, which isn't necessarily the same as self-organizing, perhaps. But he's talking about self-directed work teams, and he's talking about a group of employees who have day-to-day responsibility for managing themselves and the work they do, with a minimum of direct supervision. Members of self-directed teams typically handle job assignments, plan and schedule work, make production and or service-related decisions, and take action on problems. So this is his description of self-organization. This is published in a book, as you can see there, Leading Self-Directed Work Teams. So it's there. It's again slightly different. Jean TABAKA, who talks a lot about collaboration, a big thought leader in the agile space, she defines self-organizing and self-disciplined teams as teams that decide their own team norms and capture those in their project charter, and they will survey the skills of their members and allow or encourage the most appropriate team structure or the most useful team structure to evolve. So they have their boundaries. My view is that what I've shown here, or what I saw, seemed to confirm my view that there is no absolute definition that is commonly agreed throughout the industry as to what self-organizing team means. Obviously, I can show the ones that back up my view, but this is what I think. So I'm going to put a tick against that one. Would anybody disagree with me putting a tick against that from what you've seen here? Everybody's in complete agreement. Awesome. So four hypotheses. One of them, yeah, there is widespread confusion as to what self-organizing team means. I also think there's a lot of angst, anxiety. There are a lot of concerns around this topic of self-organization. When I run training courses, when I speak to management about Agile, about Scrum, there are usually a number of common concerns around this idea of self-organization. I'm just going to play you a very, very short video now of Ken SCHWABER, actually.
And they said, really, really good. If you have a team of outstanding engineers that are using excellent engineering tools, have engineering practices down pat, understand the business domain, the technology domain inside out, and aren't interrupted and have all the resources they need, then you can use Scrum. Well, it's true that people like that can build an increment of software every iteration. That's good. However, Scrum works with idiots. You can take a group of idiots that maybe even didn't go to school, don't understand computer science, don't understand software engineering techniques, hate each other, don't understand the business domain, have lousy engineering tools, and uniformly they will produce crap every increment. This is good. You want to know at the end of every iteration where you are.
So, Ken likes to say slightly controversial things. So it's an interesting statement. So Scrum works with idiots. Does it? I don't know. Depends on what your definition of works means, I suppose. If your definition of Scrum works means that you will find out the dysfunctionalities, the lack of quality, or perhaps the gaps in your organization pretty quickly, then yeah, Scrum works. But if your desire is to deliver quality product, quality software in a short and maintainable way, short and maintainable time frame, then does Scrum work with idiots? Probably not. Okay, this is one of the responses to the survey, which I think I could just about get away with. And basically, it's kind of saying the same thing. That if you have bad people, then you have bad people. And self-organizing isn't going to help. It's just going to mean you've got self-organizing bad people. All right? So there is a kind of comment, an accusation, if you will, about Agile at the moment, and Scrum in particular, that it talks about flaccid Scrum, where you can do Scrum, but are you really actually delivering value? Because do we have enough craftsmen in our organizations? I was just sat in on Tom Gilb's session just before this one, and he made a very clear distinction between engineers and coders. And he was concerned, he was asking himself whether there were as many engineers here as people would like to think, or do we have coders? And he was trying to make a very clear distinction between the two. And the engineers really do think about their work, they are proactive, they're systems thinking, they think highly, they work really hard, they take a lot of pride in their work, they want to increase quality, whereas coders just say, give me something to code and I'll code it. All right. The argument is that for Agile to work, for self-organizing teams to work, you need more than just coders in your team. All right. And organizations have concerns about that. Individuals have concerns about that. Am I up to this? So are people just lazy? Okay, I was running a course a while ago, and I was about halfway through, and somebody at the back of the class stuck their hand up and said, Geoff, most of what you're saying makes sense. Notice how they said most. But my problem with this Agile stuff is that people are just lazy. And what you're doing is you're taking away any opportunity for us to hold those people to account. If they make mistakes, or if their targets, if they set their own targets, they're quite low, then we're just going to fail. People are lazy. And I don't know whether this is true. My personal view is that generally people want to do a good job, the best job that they can do. But I have worked in a number of organizations where the majority of management do believe people are lazy. Now, my concern is whether this is actually true, or whether it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That by thinking people are lazy, people will act lazy. Now, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but this is something worth thinking about. But it is a natural concern of organizations. If we open up the boundaries, will we put ourselves in a position where everybody is accountable, so nobody is accountable? It's a real concern. The concept of social loafing, that if I'm a part of a group, then me slacking off a bit won't get noticed, because we're holding the group to account rather than each individual. So, concerned that if we go into this self-organization process, for want of a better word, then social loafing will increase because people are generally lazy. These are concerns. One of my own concerns, initially when I started using Scrum, do you get the weakest link over here? Survivor, Big Brother, things like that. Yeah, programs where the group are invited to vote off one of their members on a regular basis. Well, I had a concern that because we're looking at teams to make collective commitments, and teams are going to be judged on the collective delivery, that as teams identify individuals that are slightly below average in productivity or skill, then they would be incentivized to vote them off, to bring up the average of the group. That was one of my big concerns with Scrum. A number of individuals who are concerned with self-organization also think this is likely to happen. I want to be in control of what I can control. I want to be judged on what I can control. So there's the fear of the weakest link. There is nowhere to hide in a self-organizing and an agile environment. Self-organizing team is going to be judged on a regular basis at the end of every iteration. There is nowhere to hide. If we suck, people will know we suck pretty quickly. All right. So it requires a huge amount of trust, in my view. And some organizations will perhaps quite rightly think, well, our culture isn't a very trusting culture, so will self-organization work in our environment? Good question to ask. Good question to ask. So these are some of the concerns that organizations have, that management have, that individuals have, that I found pretty common. So is it worth tackling those concerns? Is my next question. Okay, is self-organization good enough that we can say, yeah, I understand your concerns, but what are you laughing at? But it's worth it. So go for it. Give it a try. All right. So it's worth thinking about whether. So my next two hypotheses that I'm going to test out now are self-organizing teams can be a motivating factor, can lead teams to work harder, to enjoy their work more and produce more, but not for everybody, and that self-organizing teams are usually more productive, but not always. There is disagreement about these factors, even in I don't know what you would call this part of the community, but the specific examples I'm going to give here are certified Scrum trainers, so people who go out and are paid to teach people Scrum, the Agile Manifesto, the concept of self-organizing teams. There's even disagreement amongst these people. So I've got permission from Dan and Tobias to use some quotes of theirs. Stan RAWSTHORNE, a CST with Collab something now, used to be Danube, but they've been taken over now. And he's talking about the Agile Manifesto and that quote that I gave right near the start, which is that the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. And he's saying he doesn't think that that's necessarily true. Certainly not in all cases. Some cases, sure, but not all. And Tobias Meyer, who's creative director of the Scrum Alliance, another certified Scrum trainer, disagrees. He thinks that self-organization is always the best way, all right? If we believe that in a complex environment, the people closest to the problem are the ones best suited to solve the problem, which is a general assumption amongst agile teams. So he believes it's always the best way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all self-organizing teams will succeed. And that when teams do fail, that's not necessarily a failure of self-organization, but more a failure of the team and the organization itself. So there's disagreement there. The study that I like the best was one by John Cotter. It's a little bit out of date now, but in there he said that 93% of teams reported increased productivity, 86% reported decreased operating costs and improved quality, and 70% reported better employee attitudes. These seem to line up with my practical hands-on experiences in organizations. For those of you that don't know, I spent a while working at British Telecom. They did their own benchmarking. Figures were pretty similar to these. Okay. So self-organizing, or in this case, self-directing work teams, tend to lead to greater productivity. The stats are good. What did our survey say? Okay. Our survey actually said that, well, this is what our survey said. So I gave them a number of options here. Okay. So basically, nearly two-thirds, so 65.8%, think that self-organization increases motivation, at least some of the time. 96% think it has at least some effect on motivation. So it has some effect. And nearly two-thirds think that it increases motivation at least sometimes. So why? All right. So I asked, what characteristics, what factors did they see in their environments that they think led to increased motivation as a result of self-organization? So the first one that came back was a presence of a challenging and achievable goal on the project. Seems to link back to one of the quotes that I gave at the start of the presentation, which is interesting. Complete trust of the team by management, that was necessary. Complete trust within the team of each other. Subtly different, but equally necessary. Ownership over the work the team commit to. So a team's not going to self-organize if they don't have the ability to affect the work that they are working on. And the fifth one of the top five, a close relationship with the end customer or users. So those were the top 5 factors that people who responded to this survey thought led to self-organization increasing motivation. Factors that had no effect on motivation. I thought that would be interesting to look at, because we have some assumptions about why self-organization affects motivation, but are they true? So the top 6 here I have slightly blurred or ambiguous roles within the team. There's talk about generalizing specialists in a self-organizing team. Was that necessary? According to the survey, no. A team can completely self-organize, be much more motivated, even if, or perhaps because of, specialists within the team. Also, it doesn't really matter if they're a line manager within the team. Apparently, you don't need to remove line management for a team to self-organize and be motivated. They don't need any training in conflict resolution. They don't even need HR practices to back them up, apparently. They don't even need highly skilled people in the team. So coming back to Ken's quote about Scrum works with idiots, perhaps it does. Right, remember, we're talking about motivation here, not about quality or productivity. We're just talking about motivation. And effective spread of personalities. So that doesn't really matter either. So I was really interested in these two because for the last few years I've been saying these two characteristics have to be there. So that contradicted what I thought was absolutely necessary. So the survey's saying these things don't matter. Productivity then, 95% of people who responded thought that self-organization increased productivity to some level. 95% thought it increased productivity. More than half of them thought it increased productivity by at least 50%. Okay, remember, they don't have any metrics on this one. Tom Gill wouldn't like this, I don't think, because it doesn't really quantify it. This is just people's perception of productivity in their organization based on self-organizing teams. But it's interesting, this is perception. Whether it's true or not, I'll never know. But it's interesting data. Yes? It's a good question, thank you. I've made an assumption there that you knew what I was talking about. So going back here, complementary HR practices. So HR means human resources. So basically personnel, things like people being paid based on group performance, promotion and career path progression to complement the concept of self-organization. Thank you for the question. So it's productivity. Okay, so Ricardo Semler, some of you may or may not have heard of him. He was the head of SEMCO in Brazil, which is, I guess, arguably a very radical change in organizational structure. And he was talking about if we don't let people do things the way that they do, we will never know what they're really capable of, and they will just follow our boarding school rules. We will never know the full potential of our people if we tell them what to do. So I'm not interested in, as he goes on, making sure that you are here, that you're giving us so many hours a day. We want people who will deliver a final result, and I will trust you. I'm adding something on the end of this. We will trust you how you do that. This is what we're kind of looking for here. So back to my hypotheses then. Again, apart from the couple of surprises around characteristics that I thought were essential, but the survey said weren't essential, I think generally the data seem to back up my view that self-organizing teams can be a motivating factor, but not for everybody, and self-organizing teams are usually more productive, but not always. Would you agree with that, based on what you've seen? Yeah? Okay. Cool. Of course, you're taking my word for it that I'm giving you this data. I look like an honest guy, right? I'm from England. We're honest in England. That's good. Okay, my last hypothesis then was that self-organization doesn't just happen. All right, it's not magic. It doesn't come for free. It doesn't come easily. What did our survey say about that one? So my way of finding out or getting some information about this hypothesis was to ask a couple of questions. And the questions I asked were, where you've seen self-organization fail, why do you think it failed? Where you've seen it succeed, why do you think it succeeded? All right. Just to see what characteristics were behind that. So we've got a lack of an effective Scrum Master to facilitate the team. Now, it's got an asterisk there because I did say, or other type of coach, stroke facilitator. So the number one answer there was a lack of an effective Scrum Master or agile coach or facilitator to facilitate the team. Over half of people, well, just over half the respondents said that when self-organization fails, this is one of the prime reasons why. The second most common answer was lack of management support. That's not usually surprising. Yes, you can self-organize, go and do that nice self-organization stuff, but when the pressure's on, I've had a go with that nice self-organization stuff, now here's what needs to happen, get this done. All right? Distinct and specific roles within teams. Interesting, because that came up earlier on as something that wasn't necessary. And this happens in surveys. You get some slightly contradictory results, which to me implies that there's a very contextual element to this. Yeah, this will be an important characteristic in some contexts, but unimportant in others. The fourth one, a lack of trust within the team of each other. They said that was important earlier on. So they're backing that up here, which is useful. Nearly half the time it fails, it's because of a lack of trust. A lack of challenging and achievable goal, again, something that came up earlier on as essential, so that's not surprising. And another one that came up earlier on, lack of trust of the team by management. So there's not too many surprising things there, but the number one, out of all those characteristics, the most commonly cited reason why a team doesn't self-organize is because of a lack of an effective scrum master or coach or facilitator. So I was interested in that one. And as you probably told from my presentation already, I like my quotes, so I see if I could find any quotes on this one. A colleague of mine, friend of mine, Nigel Baker, he said, "Scrum Masters are theoretically unnecessary, but empirically essential." Which I quite liked. I thought it was pretty good, pretty profound. Which means, in theory, if you have a self-organizing team, and you have an engaged product owner, and you have a supportive organization, then why would you really need a Scrum Master? Theoretically, you shouldn't. And that's one of the things that I say to Scrum Masters when I'm talking to them. In order for you to do your job effectively, in my opinion, you need to take on that role in the view that you're trying to do yourself out of a job. You want to make yourself unnecessary. It's probably something you'll never achieve, but it's a worthwhile aim. So Scrum Masters are theoretically unnecessary, but empirically essential. I would say that the data is backing Nigel up on that one. Going back to Kimball, he says empowerment has about a 50% success rate. Now, I realize I'm talking about empowerment here as opposed to self-organization, but I think they're close enough to be able to draw some comparisons here. And when it fails, it's due to a lack of management commitment to the change process, impatience for results, something the other people in the survey didn't pick up on, but an unwillingness to make the necessary personal changes to styles of management, and a lack of budget and time for training. Interesting. Fails about 50% of the times, apparently. Seems to be fairly consistent. Mike Cohn says we should put a lot of effort into thinking about who goes into those teams, who we staff those teams with. Just as Kimball Fisher said, I'm just going to flip back, an unwillingness to make the necessary personal management changes could be talking about from a project manager to a Scrum Master. Those in the organization responsible for initiating a Scrum project should spend a lot of effort in selecting the individuals who will comprise the team. Yeah. Mike talks a lot about leading self-organizing teams. He uses the CDE model a lot, talking about changing the influencing factors of this team, setting some boundaries for them within which they can self-organize, and then changing those boundaries as and when you notice change is necessary. Should this be the Scrum Master? Perhaps that's another question, but it looks like we need to think about who's part of this team. Again, in Mike's book, he talks about these factors, so make sure you have all disciplines covered, you have a balance of technical skills, balance of the domain knowledge, diversity, and keeping that team together. My experience tells me that teams generally don't grasp self-organization for about 3 or 4 months, and even then it takes them time to grow into it. So keeping teams together for a long period of time seems to be important. And teamwork doesn't just emerge, it requires strong leadership throughout the entire organization. So not just at the team level, not just with the Scrum Master helping that team, but also changing and and altering and influencing the organizational structure and patterns and practices and culture to encourage a more self-organizing environment. Okay. So if that's the case, what should we do to help self-organization grow? Okay. If it is worthwhile, which the survey is generally indicating, then how do we help it grow? So I asked that question, what helps it succeed? Or what characteristics are there when it succeeds? The top 9 factors here, so all fairly consistent, ranging from 47% of the people saying the same thing, picking a common characteristic, all the way up to 64%. So the ability to be held accountable for their results. This is something that has to be there. Nearly 2/3 of the people said, when it succeeds, this is present. Management support, unsurprising, close relationship with end customers, the effective Scrum Masters there, over 50% as well. That was quite a lot. So there were 9 characteristics there. I've drilled those down to what absolutely has to be there. All right, we've got ownership over the work, complete trust within the team, ability to be held to account, complete trust of the team, and this challenging and achievable goal. So these characteristics are essential for self-organization to succeed according to the survey, and a lot of people agree with that. So what are we missing out on? Why does self-organization not succeed all the time? If we know this information, if we can learn this information, disseminate it, what are teams missing at the moment? Well, according to the survey, nearly half think that teams don't take responsibility. They don't take or hold themselves, they don't hold themselves accountable for their results. Okay? Nearly half. Now, that could be because people are lazy. Could be because they're loafing. And going back to some of our concerns. Equally, it could be that organizations don't encourage it. It could be that they're still looking for one person to take accountability rather than a team. Don't know. I didn't study that. But no group becomes a team until it can hold itself accountable for their results. They're still just a group. So the survey says that's what teams are missing, holding themselves accountable. What are organizations missing out on? Why aren't they getting as much success with self-organization as perhaps they could? Sure, there must be some things. Again, the data says almost half of the people think that organizations don't understand what motivates their people. What does motivate our people? Another 20% don't feel empowered to do anything about their situation. So what does motivate people? What would you say common, absolutely must-haves for motivation are? What motivates you? Sorry? Progress? Progress in the work, progress individually, progress career-wise? All of them? Money? Promotion? Status? Perhaps? Well, first things first, if people don't think they can affect the outcome, they won't even bother thinking about how they can affect the outcome. So you're disengaging from your people if there is no thought that their efforts will be useful. Empowerment is a factor of a number of different things, including authority, information and accountability. And if any one of those is 0, then empowerment will be 0. This is what Kimball Fisher is saying, which says to me that it's very, very delicate. Empowerment is easily broken and lost. So if you get any one of those 0, or even perceived to be 0, then empowerment will be lost, and all the benefits associated with that. So keep things small is the general consensus. We go back to this, one of those first quotes at the start. A team is a small number, all right? And smaller teams lead to greater accountability. There's less loafing, there's increased interaction, there's less bandwidth and overhead, greater visibility, satisfaction. It's a good thing. Keep teams small. Teams are generally probably not small enough, according to the data that we've got here. And do these teams have appropriate leadership? My experience tells me that the wrong people, generally speaking, are leading self-organizing teams. We still have managers trying to lead self-organizing teams, and that rarely works. So we're looking for someone with these kinds of skills. Now, Kimball Fisher has nothing to do with the agile movement, really. He's not notably a Scrum person or anything like that. But these characteristics here seem, to me, to be fairly consistent with how I would define the characteristics of a good Scrum Master. Someone that will facilitate the team and the interactions, that has strong integrity, that will get rid of impediments and coach the team to a higher level themselves. So we're looking for an effective Scrum Master, someone that isn't just there to try and please everybody, right, but equally isn't there to shout at people when things don't go quite right. Someone like that. I'm interested in this reward thing. Be interested in how teams would, if they were given the opportunity, what they would select for their own reward. I remember Mike Cohn saying in one of his organizations, perhaps this was the same team that Lisa was part of, I don't know. But as a reward for delivering well after a few sprints, the team were then allowed some time and iteration to work on whatever they wanted. To tidy up the code, or perhaps try out some new technology, something like that. Perhaps that would motivate a team. Perhaps it is beer. But the overwhelming majority of people believe that organizations don't understand what motivates their people. So reward policies might be something that organizations need to look at if they want to encourage self-organizing teams. I expect quite a few of you have already seen Dan Pink's presentation on motivation. If you haven't, thoroughly recommend you have a look. It's on TED Talks. Really good. Again, nothing to do with the Agile movement. I mean, he used to write speeches for Al Gore. Not that makes him anti-Agile, I'm just saying he's not part of the Agile movement. But basically, he tries to summarize that in, if I can take the liberty of trying to summarize his speech, he talks about 3 factors being necessary to motivate knowledge workers, people who are working in creative spaces, which generally people in the software development industry are. They need to think outside the box. And he claims that these 3 characteristics are necessary to motivate people. Autonomy, control over the work that they do. Mastery, the ability to get better at something. Progress, perhaps. And a purpose. A sense that what they're doing is contributing to something worthwhile. Again, I'm not here to say whether he's right or wrong, but that doesn't seem to match up with the reward policies of a lot of organizations I've worked in. And that might be a coincidence, it might not be. This is where my data is leading me. So again, the conclusion that I made was that self-organization doesn't just happen. It requires leadership, it requires support, it requires time. And teams will get it wrong sometimes before they get it right. So I'm claiming victory in all of my 4 hypotheses. Would anybody like to disagree with me? Now, as with any data set, there are always some underlying messages that perhaps we need to look a little bit harder to pick out. So I think I might have found some more conclusions. You probably picked these out as well, no doubt. So we need some shared goals. We need some shared goals if self-organization is going to work. The team needs to be empowered. The team needs to take responsibility and be given responsibility. We need a little bit of clarity over the roles that we're playing. Yeah? Team needs autonomy. They require a coach or a scrum master. Okay? And you can't, the team doesn't get to control everything. Okay? So, there might be some more, I don't know. We require trust. both within the team and of the team. We need ownership over the goal, if self-organization is going to work. It's seen by some as an opportunity, but by some as a threat, and that's worth bearing in mind. Some people are scared by self-organization. We definitely need the team to take accountability. It's a different way of engaging our people than normal, which can be quite scary, but yes, it does work, sometimes. Okay. And surprisingly, I do have some time for questions. So, do we have any questions? Yes. Okay. So the question was, in the environment that you're working in, the Scrum Master role rotates on a sprint-by-sprint basis. So one sprint, one person will be the Scrum Master, the next sprint somebody else will be. Is that a recommended option or technique? I certainly wouldn't go so far as to say that was recommended, but it's not necessarily a bad thing either. So as with most things, classic consultant answer, it depends. There are some definite advantages to that. It can force the growth of self-organization in a team. So if you imagine that everybody in this team is going to have some exposure to facilitating the team, to removing impediments, or getting impediments removed, to playing that role, then pretty soon you'll almost have a team of Scrum Masters who are primarily developers. So great. You're increasing the cross-functionality and the ability for them to solve their own problems by stealth. That's great. The downside to that is that it takes people a little bit of time to get into the role of the Scrum Master, to work out how things get removed, how impediments get removed, how things get changed, who we need to speak to remove this impediment, who do we need to get together to get an answer to this question. Usually takes people a little bit of time to build up those kind of networking skills, and also the other soft skills that go along with being a Scrum Master. So just having one iteration's chance at it might not be enough. So it's definitely possible. It definitely has its advantages, but it also has its downsides as well. So it's definitely, my recommendation would be experiment with it, and then have a retrospective on whether that's working for you or not. Is that okay? Any other questions? Hi.
One of the problems I've seen with having, this is just my personal experience, with having a Scrum Master who's also a programmer or a tester on the team is if there is some kind of religious war on the team over, coding standards or technical solutions, the Scrum Master has a stake in the answer, where I see when the Scrum Master is a dedicated role and not a technical member of the team, it seems like they can be more impartial in facilitating conversations. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so if I can correct me if I get this wrong. Where the Scrum Master role is a shared role, so you're part developer, part Scrum Master, that can lead to a number of conflicts, not least of which when there is, I think you used the phrase, religious war. So if there's perhaps a technical challenge that the team are facing, then the Scrum Master's got a bit of a conflict because they have a stake in the outcome. They can't be as independent as if it was a dedicated role. Do I agree with that? Yes, I do. My strong recommendation, again, bearing in mind the considerations that you can increase self-organization through sharing this role, my default recommendation is that the Scrum Master should be a dedicated role, certainly in the early stages of team formation. My personal strong view is, in the early stages, you want to try and remove as many conflicts or barriers to a team being able to self-organize as you possibly can. And that's one that will always have an impact on a team, certainly in their early sprints. Anyone else? I can't really see the people at the back very well, but I wouldn't be able to hear you anyway. No? Hi. Why do I think motivation is...
So specific, why we discuss it separate? Because we have daily meetings, you should report progress. Why it's so important? Why you consider it as a special motivation problem?
So why is motivation so specifically singled out in agile methodologies? Is that what you're asking? I think all I can do is talk from my own experiences here. I'm not talking from a Scrum Alliance badge point of view or Agile Alliance. It's just my views. I think the challenges that we face in our organizations now are so complex and vast and different that we need to engage people who can solve the problems in a much different way. We need to get them wanting to be part of the solution rather than just creating a solution for a vendor or a client. And that can be an internal client or an external client. I talked earlier on in my other presentation, from a product owner's perspective, one of the biggest things you can do to increase your return on investment is to encourage the team to use the product, right? To want to be part of the solution, to want to use the product. Then they're going to give you much better results. Productivity generally increases as motivation goes up in a sustainable way. Right? You can crack a whip over people, but that's not sustainable. If the motivation goes up, it's a sustainable increase in productivity. I know when Ken Schwaber was talking in the early days of Scrum, he said he had two big desires with Scrum. One was to bring back a certain level of integrity to the software development profession, and the second was to bring back enjoyment to the software development profession. And to me, when people ask me why do I do what I do, it's because wherever I go, whenever I see teams start using Scrum, they enjoy going to work more than they did before, and they're more productive, which has got to be a win-win. So I think motivation is key because it can be done, it can be achieved through agile teams, and everyone seems to benefit from it. Does that in any way answer your question? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, yep, in the middle. How do you go about convincing management to allow self-organization? Well, I find that everyone, and I don't think I can answer that question that generically because I don't think management are that generic. I think different management, different managers, and different organizations' management have different levers. I think they feel different bits, different pains. I think they see different opportunities. So to me, one of the great things about self-organization is that it offers quite a lot, and it will focus on different areas. So different people will relate to different factors. And the only way anybody is going to do anything that you want them to do is if there's something in it for them. So you have to find something within self-organizing teams that will benefit those people. And I'm not talking about manufacturing something. I'm talking about identifying what pain point might be eased by self-organization. And then it's about building up the confidence for them to be able to take that courageous first step and say, okay, let's give it a go. So how can we reduce our risk? How can we remove or reduce as much as possible the risk of trying this? And again, in an agile environment, you reduce your risk by having short time boxes where you can get quick feedback. So the exposure to these people is a lot less. Did that in any way answer your question? Thank you. How am I doing? Do I need to? I can't see. Okay, a couple of minutes. If there's another question, then. Can't see anyone. Okay. If you're interested in more of the results from the survey, then let me know. If I just throw up my email address, you can contact me. I haven't yet put them into a beautifully polished, presentable version, but if anyone is interested in perhaps some more raw data or some data that I excluded, then just let me know and I'll disseminate them. There's no confidentiality issues because everything was anonymous. This is the first time that I've done this presentation before. I thought it was interesting, this is why I did it, but I really appreciate some feedback as to whether you thought it was interesting. So please, when you're giving the feedback, if you can add anything to it or perhaps send me an email or send me a message just to let me know what you thought, whether this was interesting to you guys. I'd really appreciate that. Other than that,